Blanco Canyon, 1871. Comanche raiders against Colonel Mackenzie's 600 soldiers. 7 men lay dead, their bodies riddled with arrows like porcupines. Another was tied to a wagon wheel and roasted alive. This was the aftermath of the Salt Creek Prairie massacre in 1871, a turning point that would forever change America's policy toward the native tribes. How did a small band of Comanche warriors defeat 600 U.S. soldiers in the Texas wilderness? If you're fascinated by the untold stories that shaped America, hit subscribe on Histories and Native Tales now. The year 1871 marked a critical turning point in the relationship between the United States and the Native American tribes of the western frontier. In October of that year, Lieutenant Robert Carter and the 4th Cavalry received orders that would lead them into one of the most dangerous missions of the era. Hunting down the Comanche warriors who had been terrorizing the Texas frontier, the westward expansion of the United States was perfectly captured in John Gass's famous Painting American Progress, which depicted American settlers pushing westward, backed by railroads, telegraph lines, and other symbols of American infrastructure. In this romanticized vision, Native Americans in Buffalo were shown being pushed off their lands, a visual representation of the nation's manifest destiny ideology that was playing out in bloody reality across the frontier. President Ulysses S. Grant had implemented what he hoped would be a more humane approach to Native American relations. In a letter to General Sherman, Grant expressed his desire that government policies would help protect them from encroachment by whites. During his first inaugural address, Grant specifically mentioned his hope that Native peoples would become Christianized and civilized terms that revealed the fundamental cultural arrogance underlying even the most well-intentioned policies. But what do you do with those who don't want your religion or your civilization? Asked one Army officer stationed on the frontier. The Comanche, in particular, fiercely resisted these assimilation efforts. Military records described them as the most powerful and dangerous of all the Indian tribes, a group responsible for more death and destruction than all the other tribes of the West combined. For settlers living on the edges of Comanche territory, life was defined by constant vigilance. Raids occurred with terrifying frequency. One colonel stationed in Texas wrote to his superiors, "If the Indian marauders are not punished, the whole country seems in a fair way of becoming totally depopulated." The brutality of Comanche and their allies, like the Kiowa, became notorious throughout the region. Rumors about the fate of those who disappeared in Comanche territory spread like wildfire among frontier communities. Parents used these stories to frighten children into obedience, warning them not to wander too far from home, lest they be taken by Comanche raiders. These weren't just frontier myths. The fears were validated by a significant increase in raids throughout 1870 and early 1871. On May 18, 1871, these fears materialized in a particularly horrific incident. A wagon train of 12 men transporting supplies to Texas forts was traveling through Salt Creek Prairie when they encountered over 100 Kiowa and Comanche warriors. 5 teamsters managed to escape, while the warriors were preoccupied with looting the wagons. One of these survivors reached Fort Richardson and reported the attack. When soldiers arrived at the scene, Lieutenant Robert Carter documented what he found. There could be nothing more appalling, heart-rending, or sickening to human senses than the spectacle of the Salt Creek Prairie massacre. 7 men lay dead, their bodies so filled with arrows they resembled porcupines. Some had been decapitated, and evidence indicated that one man who had fought back was captured, strapped to a wagon wheel, and slowly roasted to death over fire. In a twist of fate that would have significant consequences, General William Tecumseh Sherman and approximately 20 soldiers had met the same wagon train barely an hour before the attack. Had the timing been slightly different, Sherman himself might have been among the victims. This near miss had a profound effect on Sherman, who had previously been skeptical of settlers' claims about the frequency and brutality of raids. This is where we begin to see a shift in policy, noted one military historian. The damage being done on the frontier was too much to ignore, especially when it nearly claimed the life of one of the nation's top generals. The aftermath brought unexpected developments. At Fort Sill, a Kiowa chief named Satana boldly claimed responsibility for the attack, admitting to killing the 7 men on the wagon train. This confession led to his arrest, along with several other chiefs. They were subsequently convicted of murder and imprisoned, marking the first time Native American leaders had been tried in a civilian court for attacks on settlers. General Sherman wasted no time in ordering decisive action. Actions must be taken to punish and pursue these murderers. He declared, "For too long, the army has avoided Comanchería. But now it is time to head into the wolf's den and bring the Quahadi into the reservation by force, or to wipe them out." This directive signaled a fundamental shift in U.S. military strategy. As one officer observed, now, in their deliberate penetration of the heartland, the Blue Coat leaders were signaling their intent not just to protect the frontier, but to destroy the raiders themselves, to find wolves in the den and kill them. The stage was set for a military campaign that would forever change the southern plains. The mission to pursue the Quahadi Comanche would take the U.S. military into the high plains, the last unconquered region of the country, and for good reason. This vast territory presented challenges that had defeated previous military expeditions and would test the limits of even the most experienced soldiers. Not only were the high plains generally without timber and water, wrote Lieutenant Carter in his journal, they were also subject to one of the least hospitable climates in North America. Summer brought brutal heat and blowtorch winds, often exceeding 100 EF, that could destroy entire crops in days. These relentless winds caused eyes to burn, lips to crack, and bodies to dehydrate with alarming speed. In fall and winter came the dreaded northers, sudden, gale-force winds from the north that could send temperatures plummeting by 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Particularly infamous was a region in West Texas known as the Llano Estacado, or State Plains. The name originated with early Spanish explorers, who recognized that without marking the land with stakes, orientation became nearly impossible in this endless sea of grass. General Randolph Marcy, who had surveyed the region, described it in vivid terms. "When we were upon the high tableland, a view presented itself as boundless as the ocean. Not a tree, shrub, or any other object, either animate or inanimate, relieved the dreary monotony. It was a vast, illimitable expanse of desert prairie, the great Sahara of North America." Marcy concluded that no man could permanently live there, but he was wrong. For the Quahadi Comanche, this forbidding landscape was home, and they had mastered its challenges in ways that gave them tremendous tactical advantages. As a horse tribe, noted one military observer, the plains acted as highways, allowing them to travel unbelievable distances in a single day. While U.S. cavalry units typically covered 30 to 35 miles in a day's march, Comanche warriors could easily travel twice that distance. Their horses had grass to feed on in all directions, and although water sources were few, the Quahadi knew precisely where each spring, creek, and waterhole was located, knowledge that any intruder lacked. Most importantly, the plains were home to the buffalo, the Comanche's primary food source. These massive herds represented the most valuable resource in the region, and one worth defending with their lives. The Quahadi understood that their way of life depended entirely on maintaining control of these hunting grounds. By the 1870s, the technological gap between the U.S. military and Comanche warriors had narrowed significantly. American cavalry now carried Spencer carbines, highly accurate rifles with 7-round magazines. Their lever action made it possible to fire at a rate similar to Comanche arrows, but at a much greater distance. This technology made it feasible to engage the Comanche in direct battle for the first time. However, the Comanche maintained one crucial advantage. They didn't have to fight if they didn't want to. The vastness of the plains meant they could simply disappear into the landscape. Comanche warriors always kept several horses with them, ensuring they always had fresh mounts able to outrun pursuers. Chasing them presented its own dangers. As Colonel Mackenzie well understood, it was easy to get lost in an ocean of grass. Spread out supply lines became vulnerable to attack, and unless you knew exactly where you were, finding water could become impossible, all assuming you didn't lose your horses, which would mean certain death. Lieutenant Robert Carter received his orders from Colonel Mackenzie in late September 1871. The mission was straightforward but daunting: locate and engage the Quahadi Comanche near Blanco Canyon. It was impossible to know exactly where the main village would be, as the Quahadi were constantly on the move, following the buffalo herds and avoiding detection. The expedition force consisted of 600 men, primarily from the 4th Cavalry, accompanied by 20 Tonkawa scouts. The Tonkawa, traditional enemies of the Comanche and expert trackers, were recruited to serve as guides. Though they were skilled, Carter noticed their uneasiness as the expedition moved deeper into Comanche territory. The Tonkawa understood better than the soldiers what awaited them if they were captured by them for 10 days. The expedition moved across the plains without finding any sign of their quarry. The lack of contact wasn't surprising. The Comanche were masters of evasion, and the territory they needed to search was vast. But on the evening of October 9th, the Tonkawa scouts noticed something alarming. They were being watched. 4 Comanche warriors had been observed at a distance, keeping track of the American force. Perhaps they had known about us the whole time, Carter later wrote. Perhaps they wanted to be seen, to let us know that they were aware of our presence. This psychological warfare was typical of Comanche tactics, letting their enemies know they were being observed while remaining just out of reach. That night, the American troops lit fires for light and comfort, not fully appreciating that on the plains, fire acts like a beacon visible for miles to anyone watching. As the soldiers settled in for night, little did they know that these fires were signaling their position to hundreds of Comanche warriors who were already formulating their plan of attack. The hunters had become the hunted. The night of October 9th marked a turning point in the Blanco Canyon expedition. As midnight approached, the American camp had settled into an uneasy quiet. Lieutenant Robert Carter, still awake and vigilant, was the first to hear it, a single war cry, followed by a gunshot that echoed down the valley. Within seconds, the entire camp erupted in chaos. Blood-curdling yells and gunshots shattered the night as soldiers scrambled from their bedrolls, disoriented and searching for weapons. Through flashes of gunfire, Carter glimpsed the surrounding ridgelines, swarming with mounted warriors. Comanche raiders rode at full speed along the perimeter, shaking buffalo robes and ringing bells to create maximum confusion and terror. Officers shouted orders through the din as the true objective of the attack became clear. The Comanche weren't attempting to kill soldiers. They were targeting the expedition's horses. This was a strategic masterstroke. By stealing the cavalry's mounts, the Comanche could effectively neutralize the military threat without engaging in direct combat. The thundering sound of a horse stampede confirmed the success of their tactic, as approximately 70 horses and mules, nearly a third of the expedition's mounts, disappeared into the darkness. By dawn, Colonel Mackenzie faced a critical decision. Without sufficient horses, the expedition's mobility was severely compromised. After a brief council with his officers, he ordered a small detachment to follow the trail of the stolen animals. Lieutenant Carter volunteered to join Captain Edward Hale's group, which included 5 experienced soldiers. Carter had served with for years, including Private Candigreg, along with several newer recruits. The small force rode out, following the clear tracks left by the stolen herd. About 2 miles from the main camp, they crested a ridge and spotted a small group of Comanche warriors rounding up scattered horses. When the warriors noticed the soldiers, they immediately fled on horseback. A retreat that historians now recognize was a calculated move to separate the detachment from the main force. Carter, Hale, and approximately 10 other soldiers pursued the fleeing warriors. As they chased the Comanche down ravines and across an arroyo, they were being drawn deeper into unfamiliar territory. After ascending a small hill and continuing several hundred yards, Captain Hale suddenly realized their predicament. They had ridden directly into a trap. On the bluff before them appeared hundreds of Comanche warriors, their bodies and horses adorned with war paint. Many wore full war bonnets, signaling that this was no ordinary raiding party, but a major war band prepared for battle. Military historians estimate that the soldiers were outnumbered at least 20-1. Carter, drawing on his frontier experience, immediately ordered the men to form a skirmish line. Their only hope was to execute a fighting retreat back to the arroyo, using their Spencer carbines to keep the warriors at bay while the sound of gunfire would alert the main force to their predicament. The initial volleys from the Spencer rifles temporarily halted the Comanche advance. The repeating rifles' firepower represented the one advantage the soldiers held over their numerically superior enemy. However, 2 of Captain Hale's inexperienced recruits panicked and fled, further weakening the already vulnerable detachment. As the soldiers continued their tactical withdrawal, disaster struck. Private Candergregg, riding about 10 yards to Carter's right, found his horse failing beneath him. "Lieutenant, my horse is giving out," he called. The Comanche warriors, expert horsemen who understood the fatal vulnerability this represented, immediately converged on the struggling soldier. Among the warriors who raced toward Gregg was a figure who stood out from the others, a tall, powerfully built man whom Carter would later identify as Quanah Parker, the feared half-white, half-Comanche war chief of the Quahadi. His face was covered in black war paint, giving him a fearsome appearance that Carter would remember for the rest of his life. Carter attempted to provide covering fire as Parker closed in on Gregg, but the Comanche chief demonstrated superior horsemanship, using Gregg's slower mount as a shield. Despite Carter's shouted warning to draw his sidearm, Gregg reached for his weapon too late. Parker rode alongside the struggling soldier, placed his pistol against Gregg's head, and fired. Carter watched helplessly as his comrade fell dead from his horse. Military records would later refer to this as the second tragedy of Blanco Canyon, the first being the loss of their horses, and now the loss of a man. The situation grew increasingly desperate as the remaining soldiers continued their fighting retreat. Arrows rained down around them, and Comanche warriors pressed their advantage. Just as it seemed the small detachment would be overwhelmed, bugle calls echoed across the canyon. Colonel Mackenzie, having heard the sustained gunfire, was leading the main force to their rescue. The Comanche, seeing the approaching cavalry and having achieved their objectives, quickly disappeared into the landscape. The tactical brilliance of the Comanche approach was evident to military analysts who later studied the encounter. They had successfully reduced the expedition's mobility by stealing horses, demonstrated their control of the territory by leading a detachment into an ambush, inflicted casualties, and disappeared before suffering significant losses themselves. It exemplified the guerrilla warfare tactics that made the Comanche such formidable opponents. As Carter and the survivors rejoined the main force, the expedition's vulnerability became starkly apparent. They were operating in hostile territory against an enemy who understood the landscape intimately and could dictate the terms of engagement. The Blanco Canyon campaign had barely begun, and already the U.S. military was being taught a harsh lesson in the realities of frontier warfare. Quanah Parker and his warriors swiftly retreated when they spotted Mackenzie's reinforcements approaching. As Carter watched the Comanche disappear, he noticed what had prompted their withdrawal breaking. Over a distant hill were the Tonkawa scouts, screaming war cries as they rode to join the fight. Behind them rose a massive cloud of dust as the main force marched to their rescue. Carter realized the Comanche retreat had a deeper purpose. He had heard women's voices during the fight, suggesting the Cohadi village must be nearby. Parker needed to evacuate his people immediately if they were to escape the American forces. While warriors on fresh mounts could easily outpace the soldiers, moving an entire village with women, children, and possessions was far more challenging. With approximately 500 soldiers now at his disposal, Mackenzie ordered an immediate pursuit. The Americans chased the retreating Comanche westward toward the Cap Rock escarpment, the natural barrier marking the edge of the high plains. As they approached, Carter observed Comanche women at the top of the steep bluff, screaming down at the soldiers, while marksmen covered the retreat of Quanah's force. Lieutenant Carter led a group of men up a narrow trail toward the plateau. As his horse took a sharp turn, his leg smashed against a protruding boulder with such force that it sounded like the crack of a pistol. The impact was so severe that Carter momentarily lost consciousness. When he came to, his men were giving him water, but the Cohadi had disappeared into the hills and ravines. Quanah had successfully escaped to warn the village. By 2:30 p.m., the Tonkawa scouts reported finding a clear trail that would lead to the Comanche village. Only then did Carter attend to his injured leg, which had swollen so severely that his boots had to be cut off. The examination revealed his leg was black and blue, covered with clotted blood from multiple lacerations. Though not broken, the doctor splinted it as a precaution. As the medical examination concluded, trumpeters sounded the call to prepare for immediate departure. Mackenzie, hearing of Carter's condition, summoned him and offered him the opportunity to return to fort with other soldiers, whose mounts had been stolen. Despite being demoralized and exhausted, Carter refused to leave the expedition. remembering Private Gregg's sacrifice. "If it is left to me, I go forward with a command," Carter insisted, despite Mackenzie's warning that if his leg worsened or he lost his horse, he would be stranded in hostile territory. After several days of pursuit, the expedition finally discovered the remains of a large Comanche village along the Brazos River. The site had been hastily abandoned lodge poles, and various belongings scattered on the ground indicated a rapid evacuation. Military estimates suggested the Comanche had moved over 1,000 people, 3,000 horses, and hundreds of lodges in their escape. The trail left by the fleeing village deliberately crossed and recrossed itself, temporarily confusing even the skilled Tonkawa trackers. By the second day, it became clear the Comanche were ascending the Cap Rock Escarpment, a steep, 1,000-foot climb from the rolling plains below. Carter expressed amazement that an entire village could manage such a difficult ascent. As the soldiers continued their pursuit, the weather began to deteriorate. The temperature dropped rapidly as the wind intensified, tearing through the soldiers' summer uniforms. Carter recognized the signs of an approaching norther, a dangerous cold front that could potentially kill the entire column if they were unprepared. Despite the village being visible just 2 or 3 miles in the distance, the deteriorating conditions presented a life-threatening situation. With sleet and snow beginning to fall, Mackenzie reluctantly called off the pursuit. Carter was furious, believing this was their best chance to capture the Quahadi village. But Mackenzie prioritized the safety of his men. The storm intensified through the night, with hail pelting the animals and leaving bruises on the soldiers' bodies. The men improvised canvas shelters to protect themselves from freezing conditions. As their supplies dwindled and animals began showing signs of exhaustion, Mackenzie made the difficult decision to turn back. The animals were now suffering for water, Carter later wrote, and some were beginning to show clear signs of giving out. Our chow or rations were growing slim. The Comanches, by that lucky storm for them, still had a night's march ahead of us. So he prudently, but most reluctantly, turned back. The entire mission had failed at every critical juncture. The Comanche consistently stayed one step ahead, and when the Americans finally closed the gap, nature itself intervened to prevent their victory. During the return journey to Blanco Canyon, Mackenzie's frustration became evident when he recklessly rushed to the front during an encounter with 2 Comanche stragglers, taking an arrow to the leg before the warriors were overwhelmed. Despite this failure, the Blanco Canyon expedition marked a significant shift in U.S. military policy. As historian S.C. Gwynn noted, previous military expeditions had violated Comancheria's borders and had introduced the Indians to the idea that their home ranges were no longer completely safe, but they had done nothing to change the basic balance of power. Now, in their deliberate penetration of the heartland, the Blue Coat leaders were signaling their intent, not just to protect the frontier, but to destroy the raiders themselves. The Comanche's strength, which had reigned supreme for decades, was beginning to wane. Their population was small, and they were increasingly outgunned. Within 4 years, they would be forced onto reservations, with Colonel Mackenzie leading that final campaign. For his extraordinary courage during the strategic retreat at Blanco Canyon, Lieutenant Carter would later receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. The clash at Blanco Canyon reveals how the most powerful military in the world struggled against warriors who mastered their environment and adapted their tactics accordingly. The American frontier was won not through decisive battles, but through a series of brutal, complex encounters that tested the limits of human endurance on both sides.